Calf in the Cottage, Chapter 2. Mandy and James stood side by side watching the farmer. "Look," he said. "Look how her tail's raised. That's one of the ways you can tell they're about to calve." "Is there anything we can do to help, Mr. Matthews?" Mandy asked. "No, love. I think you best be off to that mill of yours. Day'll be gone otherwise." "Are you sure?" asked James. "Positive. I'm going to get Mabel into one of the calving boxes so that I can keep an eye on her. She needs somewhere warm and safe to have her babies." Mandy knew that the calving boxes on Mr. Matthews' farm were brick outbuildings about the size of large garages. The floors were covered with lots of fresh straw to keep the animals clean and dry. "Can we come back later?" asked James, "to see how she is?" "You'll be most welcome if you've time, but go on now, off with you." Mandy and James waved goodbye, then crossed the cubicle shed and went out into the yard. The road to Barnall Mill was an easy downhill ride from Burnside Farm, and it took the two friends only a few minutes to get there. When they arrived, the place was teeming with people and animals. The spring sunshine was warm, and Mandy felt her spirits rise. "Hey, look who's over there!" shouted James. Mandy turned to where James was pointing and saw the sturdy, short-haired figure of their friend Lydia Fawcett. She was wearing her usual corduroy trousers and jacket, and was standing behind a stall selling the wonderful goat's milk and cheese which she produced on her small holding. The two of them strolled over to see her. "Hello, you two?" Lydia smiled at Mandy and James. "Have you just arrived?" "Yes, we were held up at Burnside Farm," said Mandy. She proceeded to tell Lydia all about Mr. Matthews. "Well, if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. Perhaps he'd like some of my goat's cheese." "Thanks, Lydia," said Mandy. "You're not entering Houdini for the pet show, are you?" said James with a grin, changing the subject. "I don't think that would be a very good idea," said Lydia, still smiling. "And anyway, he's a working animal." "Working at escaping," laughed Mandy. "Oh, he's not so bad these days. Not since Ernie Bell built that strong new fence." "Mandy! Mandy Hope!" Mandy turned to find Mrs. Ponsonby bearing down on her. Mrs. Ponsonby was a large woman who lived at Grand Bleakfell Hall and wore pink spectacles. Her blue-rinsed hair was hidden under an enormous straw hat, which sported clusters of cherries. As always, she was carrying Pandora, her Pekingese dog, and had Toby, her little mongrel, on a lead at her heels. Mrs. Ponsonby was gasping and red in the face. "Mandy, I'm so glad I found you. You're the only one I can trust with my precious darlings." "What's the matter, Mrs. Ponsonby?" asked Mandy. "Well, may you ask, my dear," said Mrs. Ponsonby dramatically. "Well, may you ask." "What is it, Mrs. Ponsonby?" James asked, trying hard not to grin. "That unspeakable animal of Marjorie Spry's! Words fail me." "You mean Patch?" asked Mandy. Patch was a lovely little cat. It was Mandy and James who had persuaded elderly Marjorie and her twin sister Joan to give him a home in the first place. James turned away, pretending to examine one of the stalls. His shoulders were shaking with laughter, and he knew Mrs. Ponsonby would have a fit if she saw him. "Yes, I do mean Patch." Mrs. Ponsonby drew herself to her full height. "You may know that I am president of the Barnall Mill Appeal Fund." Mandy didn't, but she nodded anyway. "Well, the wretched animal has eaten my speech." "Eaten your speech?" Mandy's voice was faint with suppressed laughter. She could imagine Mrs. Ponsonby's words going round and round in poor Patch's stomach, like laundry in a washing machine. "Needless to say, there's very little time to write another, especially with two dogs to look after." "Can't you put Pandora down on the ground?" suggested James, who'd come back to join them now that he had his laughter under control. "Certainly not," said Mrs. Ponsonby, with a shudder of horror. "You never know what she might pick up. Anyway, you must look after them for me, Mandy dear, whilst I dash off another speech. Think of it as your contribution to the Barnall Mill Appeal Fund." "Yes, of course, Mrs. Ponsonby." Mandy took Pandora and Toby from their anxious mistress. "They're such lovely dogs." Mrs. Ponsonby beamed. Any friend of her dog's was a friend of hers. "We'll just wander round if that's all right," said James, taking Toby. "Take good care of my little darlings." She nodded her head graciously, as if dismissing them all, then sailed away like a galleon at full mast. "I hope poor Patch hasn't got stomachache after eating Mrs. Ponsonby's speech," said Mandy. "He's probably quaking with fear at the thought of having to face Mrs. Ponsonby," he replied. Mandy and James wandered round, chatting to friends and looking at animals. It seemed as though half of Welford was here, and all their pets. They met Kate, Mandy's friend from school, with her rabbits, and Tommy Pickard with his hamsters. Tommy was clutching a piece of paper with the number 14 on it. "I've lost my granddad, and I can't find where I'm supposed to be," he said. "And the show starts in 10 minutes. Grandad was Walter Pickard, a retired butcher who lived in the row of cottages behind the Fox and Goose. His wife Mary had died, but he still shared his home with the 3 cats they'd both loved so much. He was a firm friend to Mandy and James, even though he could never remember their names. "Don't worry, Tommy, he won't be far away," said James. "We'll help you find your place." They soon found the small pet section, which was being judged in one of the marquees. "Number 14!" yelled Tommy, spotting a space on one of the tables. Mandy and James helped Tommy to set up the hamster's large cage, making sure the sawdust was smooth, positioning the water bottle exactly right. Tommy was very fussy. "They're asleep," he remarked gloomily, peering into the hamster's bedding. "Never mind," said Mandy. "Hamsters do sleep in the day. The judge will expect them to be asleep." "Will he?" said Tommy, brightening up a little. "You bet," said James with a grin. "Oh, there you are!" The voice boomed from the doorway of the marquee, and the 3 friends saw Tommy's grandad coming towards them. "Hello, young miss. Hello, young sir. Hello, Tommy." Walter Pickard turned to the 2 friends. "Tommy and I lost each other," he explained. "Yes, Tommy told us," said Mandy. "Well, thanks for looking after him," said Mr. Pickard. Mandy and James waved as they went off to look at the other animals. There were white rats, gerbils, more hamsters, a chipmunk, even stick insects. "I don't think I could cuddle one of those," said James, peering into the fish tank where they were kept. "They're interesting, though," said Mandy, "once you manage to spot them against the sticks." They strolled outside to the ring where the dog show was being held, but Pandora wouldn't stop barking at the other dogs. "Come on," said James. "She's not going to be quiet till we move away." "Bet that Airedale wins," said Mandy, following James reluctantly. "He's a beauty." "Look, Mandy," James gave her a nudge. "There's one of the Spry twins with Patch." "Which one is it?" asked Mandy. "Miss Joan or Miss Marjorie?" The 2 old ladies were hard to tell apart. "I don't know. I can't tell the difference," said James. "Hello, Miss Spry," said Mandy. "I hear Patch has been eating Mrs. Ponsonby's speech." Miss Spry went a little red and smiled sheepishly. "I'm afraid Mrs. Ponsonby left it on the table next to Patch's carrying basket. He must have pulled it through with his paw bit by bit. He didn't really eat it, though, just chewed it up a little." "Well, that's a relief," said James. "I was just waiting for Patch to meow in Mrs. Ponsonby's voice." They all laughed, and James turned red. Mandy bent forward to have a look at Patch, completely forgetting that she'd got Pandora under her arm. She stood up quickly as soon as she felt the little dog wriggle and squirm at the sight and smell of the cat. But it was too late. With one final twist, Pandora jumped out of Mandy's arms. "Oh no, James! Help!" James sprang after Pandora, who was running round in circles at the foot of the table, but he was hampered by Toby, who didn't see why he should miss out on all the fun. Toby took the lead out of James's hand, just as James thought he had a hold on Pandora's collar. Now both dogs were tearing around like mad things. Mandy dived after James, knocking the cat basket as she did so. It fell to the ground, and they all heard Patch give an unearthly yowl. Before anyone could do anything, they saw the door come unfastened. Patch escaped. Toby tore after Patch, running right across Mandy's feet as he did so. This time, Mandy was quicker. She dived once again and just managed to grab the end of Toby's lead, pulling him to a halt. It was all rather undignified, and Mandy lay sprawled flat out on the grass. She pulled herself up, brushed herself down, and bent to pick up Toby. "You're a bad boy, Toby," she whispered in his ear. But Toby took no notice. He was too busy watching Patch and Pandora. The two animals stood facing each other, Patch hissing and Pandora growling. Pandora stepped backwards, deep little growls in her throat. Patch stepped backward too, his back arched and his ears back. Pandora stepped forwards, Patch stepped forward. Pandora stepped back, and Patch stepped back. It was as though they were practicing some sort of dance. An amused crowd had gathered to watch the two animals. Pandora flopped down onto her tummy and started to worm her way towards Patch, still with a little growl rumbling in her throat. The cat began to back away and hiss. "This is brilliant," said James. "Do you think we could charge people to watch?" "I think we ought to get hold of Pandora before Mrs. Ponsonby gets back." "Oh, heck," said James. "I think you're too late." "Oh, my poor little Pandora! Oh, my poor darling!" Mandy's heart sank as she saw Mrs. Ponsonby pushing through the little crowd of people, the cherries on her hat bobbing wildly. She lunged to scoop the little dog up into her arms, but somehow, between clutching her hat and holding onto her handbag, Mrs. Ponsonby missed. She did a little pirouette and collapsed in a not very graceful heap on the grass. Oh, Mrs. Ponsonby, I'm so sorry. Pandora just leaped out of my arms." Mandy held out her hand, but Mrs. Ponsonby ignored it and struggled to her feet by herself. "First my speech, and now this. Just wait till I see your parents, Mandy Hope. I thought you were a sensible girl. I thought I could trust you." But, Mandy tried to defend herself, but she couldn't get a word in. She turned to see James handing Patch back to Miss Spry, then turned to pick up Pandora as calmly as if nothing had happened. Good old James. "We're so sorry, Mrs. Ponsonby," Mandy heard him say. "The dog went wild when they saw the cat. There was nothing we could do about it." Mrs. Ponsonby sniffed, but Mandy could see that she was a little soothed by James's good manners. "I just hope they haven't picked up some dreadful disease," Mrs. Ponsonby said. "Not everyone's as particular with their pets as I am. However, I have no wish to prolong this any further. I have my speech to think about." Mrs. Ponsonby turned and swept away as if she were the Queen. "Oh dear," said Mandy. "I didn't make a very good job of dog-sitting, did I?" "Never mind," said James. "It wasn't your fault." "Hello again, young 'uns." Mandy saw Walter Pickard waving at them from the door of the marquee. He was holding a large cat basket in one hand. "Hello again, Walter," she called as he ambled towards them. "I didn't realise you'd bought the cats. How are they?" "Champion, thank you, but I've only brought Missy. Scraps and Tom are at home. I thought Missy might stand a chance in the cat show." "She's got a beautiful coat," said Mandy. Walter chuckled. "Jolly well ought to have. The things she eats. Turns her nose up at everything, except the best fish and chicken breast." "Oh, well, I hope she wins anyway," said James, scratching Missy's nose through the wire of the basket. "I enjoyed your little performance with those dogs of Mrs. Ponsonby's. I thought it was one of the sideshows put on specially." "Not exactly," said James, going red. "It was a bit of a disaster, actually." "Oh, I shouldn't worry too much about that," Walter chuckled again. "I saw you cycling into Burnside Farm on my way down here," he said. "How is John Matthews?" Mandy smiled. There weren't many secrets in a small place like Welford. James told him what had happened that morning. Mr. Pickard listened, nodding now and again. "And of course it won't help with Sam Weston pushing him to sell," he said quietly. "Sell the farm?" Mandy gasped. "But Mr. Matthews has always lived there." "You and I know that, but try selling it to Sam Weston. You mark my words, he won't rest easy until he's either bought Burnside Farm or made John Matthews' life a misery in the process of trying." Sam Weston was a pretty ruthless farmer. He had no time for people or animals. The only thing he seemed to care about was how much money he could make. Mandy and James stood silently. Things were worse than they thought. "Anyway," said Mr. Pickard, "I'm off now. See you again." The two friends spent the rest of the afternoon watching the judging. To their delight, Tommy Pickard's hamsters won first prize. Tommy could hardly stand still, he was so thrilled. Mandy was also pleased to find that the Airedale had won the dog show. But when the winners of the cat show were announced, Walter Pickard looked a bit down in the dumps. Missy hadn't been placed. "She's a finer cat than the winner, in my opinion," he said. Mandy and James tried to console him, and he soon cheered up. They left him chatting to Tommy, who still had a big grin on his face. At least one of the family had won a prize. "Should we get going now?" asked Mandy. "I think we've seen all we want to see, haven't we?" "Probably," said James. "But we'll miss Mrs. Ponsonby's speech if we go now, and I really don't want to do that." "James!" Mandy could hardly believe her ears, but when she looked at him, she saw that he was laughing. She gave him a playful thump on the arm. They walked over to the fence where they'd chained their bikes. "Race you home," said James. But Mandy was thoughtful, not in the mood for racing. "We've got time to go and see Mr. Matthews again," she said. "I think we ought to pop in. It's on the way." "I wonder if the calves have been born yet," said James. "I hope so. I've never seen twin calves before," said Mandy. "Do you think they'll look like the Mrs. Spry?" asked James. Mandy laughed. We could call them Marjorie and Joan." The two friends were pushing their bikes up the steep hill away from Barnall Mill. In the distance they could hear Mrs. Ponsonby's voice booming through the microphone. "Seriously though, James, I think we need to keep an eye on things up at Burnside Farm, especially now that Mr. Matthews has hurt his arm. It's not going to make it any easier for him, and I'm worried about the animals." "Well, that shouldn't be any problem," said James. "But I don't think you've got anything to worry about. Mr. Matthews knows what he's doing." "Yeah, but he doesn't normally have Mr. Weston to worry about," said Mandy. The two friends had reached the top of the hill. They mounted their bikes and rode on. It wasn't long before they saw the gate of Burnside Farm. They'd just turned into it when a Land Rover approached them from the drive. It was going at breakneck speed and throwing up clouds of dust in its wake. As it came nearer, they had to stand back against the fence to let it pass. It was Sam Weston. His face was red, and there was a look of pure rage on his face. "I wonder what's bitten him?" asked James. Mandy shrugged. She just hoped he hadn't upset Mr. Matthews. They left their bikes in the farmyard and began to look for Mr. Matthews. Eventually they found him in one of the carving boxes and the carving cow. There was no sign of any calves. "We've just seen Mr. Weston," said James. "He looked in a boiling rage. Are you okay?" Mr. Matthews' face was weary. "I'm fine," he said, "but I'm afraid Marble's having a few problems. Both of the calves are trying to be born at the same time and they're getting in each other's way. I think it's going to be a long and difficult birth. I'm going to need your parents' help, Mandy." "Shall I go and phone for you?" asked Mandy. "Aye, thank you. I'd rather not leave this old lady at the moment." He pulled gently at Marble's soft ears. "Phone's on the kitchen dresser, Mandy." Mandy ran across the farmyard to the house, her heart beating rapidly. She knew that twins were usually smaller than single calves, and being born early would mean that they were likely to be smaller still. Would they be strong enough to survive?